This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights, where we bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we welcome Shelby Edwards, the CEO, founder, and lead coordinator of Inclusive Communication Services, ICS. She's here to discuss the importance of accessibility in media, ICS's services and mission, and how accessibility formatting is being integrated in video publication today. Shelby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Well, and thank you as well. Let's start off by giving our audience our audio self-descriptions. I am a 50-year-old woman wearing a very light pink turtleneck today. I have wavy, long brown hair with some reddish tones in it, and I use the pronouns she and her. Shelby, if you'd like to share your self-description and a little bit more about yourself and the work you do.
Great, thanks. So I am a white woman around 32. I have wavy brown hair, and I'm currently wearing black, a blazer, and a blouse. I'm originally from Tennessee. I currently reside in New York City. My background and degree is in sign language interpreting. I was a sign language interpreter for about 10 years before a colleague and myself, my co-founder, we decided that we wanted to be behind the screens, making the change in an even stronger way. They say entrepreneurs come from different backgrounds, and for us, it was just wanting to be the change we wanted to see in the world. So that's why we created Inclusive Communication Services, or ICS.
I love that story. I also think about, invention as being something that is really looking at something that's needed and people who are aware of a need that isn't met. And I think that is where the real entrepreneurship and energy comes from. So thank you so much for sharing that about yourself. And so there are so many things I think that we can talk about when it comes to accessibility and what people may or may not know in the general public. So for those who don't know right now, let's talk about Inclusive Communication Services. Talk to us about that, the services, your mission, and where people can go from here.
Great. So Inclusive Communication Services, ICS, we are a language interpreting and translation company. We provide accessibility services for communities such as the deaf, deafblind, blind, low vision, hard of hearing, or limited English proficient. These communities deserve equal access to all of the information that I myself, privileged as a sighted hearing person, have, and that's the heart of our mission at ICS. We've been around since 2016, but specifically diving into media accessibility, I would say since COVID-19. We began solely providing sign language interpreting services because that's our background, that's what we know. And we did that for about 3 to 5 years before we saw another gap, which was the gap in services for media accessibility. And so that's when we started to dive into that realm, which we found out was actually very new. So if there's anything I'd love for people to take away from this podcast, is that it is okay if you don't know or don't understand or are not sure how to start. Because even as language experts, we only started this a few years ago. And people were doing it before, but not at a very high rate. So this is still new territory. And it's one that we're really excited to be jumping into.
And I think that your use of the word language is so critical right here. When we talk about sign language and so many things. So like the difference between interpretation and translation, right? Two very different things. Also, when it comes to media accessibility and the shutdown. So I'm going to back up and go to the first question, the difference between translation and interpretation, because there's a big difference there. So give us the definitions, if you would.
Sure. So what's important to remember is the timing of the situation. So if you have a live event, someone is standing there with you at a podium, interpreting what you are saying, that is live, that is interpretation. They are hearing, they are processing, and then they are putting sign language onto their hands to match the meaning of what is being said. That is the process of interpreting. The process of translation is seeing something that already exists and then making that transition not in real time necessarily. So that That's what's most confusing with the requests that we get every day. People think they want CART, for example. CART stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. And CART is done in real time, whereas captioning can also be done in post-production. So what is confusing is that they are the same services, they produce the same result. One is live, one is after the fact. Being able to distinguish that can relieve a lot of the confusion.
Yes. And when you initially were talking about it, you said people are, maybe not necessarily comfortable with asking for what they need or even knowing what they need. And I think that that is somewhat an across the board feeling for maybe the general population who isn't necessarily as familiar with the disability community, fears in saying the wrong words or being or saying something that might be insulting without meaning to. And I know we've talked about this a little bit before. What's your advice there, right? Like asking questions, you have to ask the questions if you don't know the answers, right? So please give us your take on that.
The best advice that I can possibly give, because language is important, PC language is important, it all matters, particularly to the communities that it affects. So this is a very important consideration. I don't want to wave it off as saying, just try your best, because that's not actually my advice. My advice is to trust in someone who has studied this, someone who knows. Find that local partner, whether it be an agency like ICS or whether it be an interpreter that you know personally, whether it ideally be someone from the deaf community. Find an expert and ask your questions and educate yourself to the best of your ability, but also don't be afraid to ask. I don't think that it's reasonable to know all these acronyms and to understand fully what services are needed when, but it is reasonable to seek out that advice in a local partner and say, you do this every day. Here's my material. What should I do with it? And that's one thing that ICS loves to emphasize, that the consult phase, the talking about it, the discovering, the figuring out which service is right for you, that is the most crucial step in making media accessible.
I think that's what's so valuable about your services. Aside from really bringing the services to organizations and events, is being the resource so those questions can be asked in an environment where the experts are who you are speaking to. And education goes a long way when it comes to something you're really unfamiliar with and might be a little uncomfortable with. So thank you for that. And also another thing I think that the general population may be a little bit more familiar with now after the shutdown, but the difference between closed caption and sign language of any kind is different. They're different languages. Can you talk a little bit about that and some common barriers to getting both of those things accurate?
Absolutely. And this is again where that consult comes into play, because if you don't meet with someone who understands that and talk with them about your product, you wouldn't necessarily think it necessary to have two forms of accessibility. It's a very common misconception that all deaf people read captions in English. Everyone knows English as well as their first language. They can read it quickly as the captions float across the screen, and then your material is accessible. And that's just not the case. So many deaf people, sign language is their first language. So for any of us who took Spanish in high school, it's the equivalent of watching Spanish captions. It's a second language. Yes, they may be able to read and write. That doesn't mean that their primary language is written English. So having both provides blanket accessibility that is ideal, because that way people who are hard of hearing, their first language is English, they prefer captioning, that's there for them. But then people who are deaf who primarily sign, their first language is visible to them. This is a really beautiful example of this, came from this project that I worked on with a large tech company, and they were doing research with members of the blind community. And at no point did they think of including audio description within their materials that they were sending to the very people they were asking for feedback. So a quick consult later, we were able to share with them that there's not a one size fits all for accessibility. Captioning alone is great, but it doesn't always provide accessibility for all communities.
And when we talk about accessibility, I think this is a great segue into media accessibility, right? I mean, during the shutdown, we saw more people using sign language than ever before publicly, I think. Here at DRNY, we certainly had an ASL case with our former governor in ensuring in-camera live translation happening. And there have been, I think, more people signing at larger events. And I feel like there are a lot of efforts being made in that area. And still, when I even think back about the Super Bowl last year, we had a great actor who was signing as the national anthem is being sung, right? And there was no coverage of that. There was the announcement that he would be there, and then only if you had a certain code or a certain website were you able to see that. And those type of one-off scenarios are creating a barrier in and of itself. So let's talk about a little or a few of those instances and how they really affect the community that they're supposed to be really creating accessibility for.
There is a lot to unpack there. But yes, first of all, thank you so much for the work that you did with the 2020 case. That was incredible. There's never a more vital time to see an interpreter on a screen than national emergencies. So this is excellent work. I think the most important thing to consider in that vein is early stages of development planning. What we see often is the concept of an afterthought. And anytime you have an afterthought, it's not going to go as well as if you had put it in the books a year ago. This is especially true for large events. We see it all the time. Things like the Super Bowl or large events where there are unions involved. There are red tape everywhere. There is red tape everywhere. There are rules, and you can't just stick an interpreter on the screen in the last 48 hours. So I think the crucial part there is planning it in early stages of development. I tell people every day, if you are hosting an event that requires a stage, you don't think twice about planning for the stage equipment. You don't think twice about hiring caterers if your conference goes over meal times. There are just things that are in early consideration. And when they're built in, they are so much more seamless and you won't run into all of those barriers.
That's so true when we think about the way that we have our checklists for events that we have. And I always think about the passing the microphone, right? And if there's an event and there isn't a microphone for the person who's speaking in the audience, and often it's not even someone in the audience, sometimes someone who is speaking will move away from the microphone and say, I don't need to use it. And so there's a big distinction between the person who is maybe at a conference and their audience. Let's talk a little bit about those differences and how, when we're talking about accessibility, we are talking about making sure that everyone can participate equally.
Right. No, I agree. I think if there's one thing really two things that the pandemic actually taught us, so throughout COVID, is that no one likes isolation. People want connection, they want information. And I think now that people have experienced that, not necessarily related to language, it's a little easier to understand why we need interpreters now, why people want that, why they want their media accessible. So we have that motivation now. Now it's about cleaning up the logistics. Okay, how do we plan for it? How do we budget for it? Who do we go for it? And which do we need? The other thing that COVID really taught us is that technology has this ability already. We weren't tapping into it before. Most people didn't have a paid Zoom membership until COVID, and here we are. But it existed. We didn't use it very often, but it existed. So we didn't really fully appreciate what is already available to us that we can utilize to improve communication gaps. Like, it's there. We just have to tap into it.
I think that's such a good point. When we think about technology and the rate at which it is just leaps and bounds ahead of, even when we think about the beginning of 2020. As you said, people may have had a Zoom subscription then, but it was probably the free version. And now people are really investing in that way because it is so necessary. And any and all of the platforms are really continuing to try and keep up with accessibility in certain ways. We have AI for closed captioning a lot. We have programs that are creating AI systems for ease and accessibility, which I think it's always interesting that those two words go together, right? And I don't necessarily think they were put together in that phrase necessarily for the disability community. However, there are so many different ways that technology is helping right now. And I'm going to bring it all the way back to the beginning of entrepreneurs, right? Where we have small businesses that are being created every single day by sometimes one or two people. And small businesses have a lot to contend with when it comes to budgeting, right? So when they're thinking about accessibility, a lot of times, having conversations with people, they'll tell me, I mean, it's such a, it's going to be such a big expense. And then I'll say, well, what expenses are you actually looking at, right? Because so many of them, as you said, are already there. Let's talk a little bit about small businesses and independent content creators, and talk about how they can, in fact, be utilizing accessible tools that are within the platforms.
Yeah, amazing. So often what I tell people is to just get started with that consult because sometimes it's a daunting task and you don't realize that it's not actually going to be that expensive. It's not actually going to be that hard. And then also, it's a permanent solution. It's something that will last throughout the entire time the media is present on YouTube. So if you look at the lasting ripple effect it can have. So a great example of this is we had a very large event that we've been providing interpreters for years. It's normal. They love accessibility. They're very excited to contact us every year and say, we're ready to schedule our interpreters. But there weren't a lot of deaf people coming to the event. So we thought about media. We thought, okay, let's do a commercial inside. This maybe cost them less than $500 when all was said and done. And they had a total of 6 new clients show up to their event, and these are ticketed events. So you have to look at, did that actually cost them anything? So in the long run, it's actually not as expensive as it seems. So my advice to small business, independent creators, um, contact ICS, contact a small company like ICS, and just meet with them and discuss the options. See what can be done, see how much it would actually cost before you assume that there's no budget in place for this or that there are no options. Another creative solution we've offered in the past is, okay, let's have AI do an attempt at it, and then we'll get our staff, our professionals to proof it with human eyes. Then you're only paying for a proofread. Right. So this is a way that we can utilize the technology available to us, but also being respectful of the communities who will watch it by making sure that we have human eyes on it.
And that's such a good point. And I love that you're talking about the increase in customers, right? Where we've heard, and I'm sure you have, there are places, brick and mortar businesses that are not accessible for anyone who's using a mobility device, right? And sometimes the response will be, well, we don't have customers who use mobility devices. And the reality is, well, they don't because they can't get in. So that is an issue. And when we think about businesses, especially, in entrepreneurs, and if you're budget forecasting or creating even your business plan, you want to look at your bottom line and what are your margins for your audience that are going to impact your bottom line in a positive way. And what there's overwhelming evidence is that if you are solving with or starting with accessibility, it will impact your bottom line very nicely. You will have more customers, you will make more money. So talk a little bit about that in terms of how people can really be utilizing accessibility as a tool to increase business.
Absolutely. It does just that. It really does increase business in the long term, sometimes even the very short term. So obviously we would all love to just say it's the right thing to do, and that's reason enough. And in many cases it is, and then we troubleshoot any barriers. But when that's not the case, or when the bottom line is extra important, I would just show the evidence. I have graphs that I show customers every day that show that you actually increase your audience. And it's not simply that, okay, if you put an interpreter on your videos, now deaf people are your customers. That's not really what I'm talking about. You change your whole brand when you prioritize inclusivity. So it creates a ripple effect. And I personally shop places that I know are accessible, strictly because on principle, I know they are accessible. I know they are inclusive. So the branding goes a long way. I tell people a lot to remember. For a long time, Delta was the only airline that had sign language in their video. When you do the beginning flight intro, I guess is what you would call it. And
For
now you start
safety.
seeing it more and more. Yeah, the safety video. Now you see it more and more. But at that time, if it was the only one, I would so rather fly Delta, only because I knew, like, hey, this company values all people who purchase tickets, not just the ones who see and hear like everyone else. So it goes a long way for branding, for business, and because it's the right thing to do. So it's a
That's
trifecta.
right. And that makes me think of, our next area. So I was one of the very few people who did not see the Barbie movie as soon as it came out. And I really didn't think I would watch it. I have older children that I thought they're not necessarily going to want to see this with me. And then Barbie came out with their ASL version on HBO, and I thought, oh my God, I have to watch this. Like, I can't wait to watch this. It wasn't even like, now I have to, like, now I can't wait to. I wanted to see how it was done. I wanted to see where they were placed. I wanted to see, what did it look like? And it was beautiful, right? Like, it was just beautiful. And I watched that version with my two nieces, and they were like, how do you know what she's saying? Which I thought was such a great question, right? Well, if there's someone who wasn't able to hear the dialogue, how would they know what they were saying? And it is such a shift. And I could see both of their eyes going, oh, okay. And I mean, I was just so excited about it. And I think that why don't we have all of our movies with this? Talk a
Well, the
little.
goal is
Yeah,
the
go
goal
ahead.
would be to absolutely have
Right.
all movies. And it's not only Barbie. There are some Disney movies that have done this, some children's shows that have bridged this gap, which I love to see, specifically for kids whose English is not nearly as fast as captions go yet, right? So this is great. I cannot speak for the deaf community in terms of their actual reaction to the Barbie movie because I have the privilege of hearing and seeing myself. But I did run this by some of my deaf staff because I was curious what they thought as well. So I've got a quote from one of my deaf coordinators here. So quote, with Barbie, we are one step closer to having truly accessible media. Max has shown us that's HBO Max, has shown us that the possibilities of media accessibility doesn't end at closed captions only. The possibilities are endless, end quote. So I think that's the consensus of everyone on my staff. It's just we are so happy to see it in the mainstream because this triggers minds during those early planning stages. This opens doors. And it's great to see that it was such a popular mainstream movie that was chosen for this. So we were really thrilled.
Right. And not only was it a mainstream movie, but the messaging within it really was, we're talking about brand, we're talking about inclusivity, and it was really challenging a lot of cultural norms. So it certainly was this, if there was going to be a movie to start this off, this was a great one to do it. And what I also found fascinating about it was that, so as an adult who maybe has seen Disney movies over and over and over again, how we know what, so if you are a person who does hear, you are able to know what is being said. So often this is used in reverse in doing like French or Spanish or any of the Romance languages that a lot of movies are interpreted into. So to learn another language, knowing already what the dialogue is, gives children and adults the ability to see what signing really would look like for those words, for those phrases, and could really create more of a generation and a culture of learning ASL in a way that would be very natural to them. What are your
I love
thoughts
that.
on, go ahead, on people learning more ASL right now?
I love that. I really truly look forward to the day where, just as Netflix has the drop down where you can do Spanish, French, etc., that there's that ASL option there everywhere. I think that would be incredible. In terms of the learning ASL, I think it's absolutely a really great goal to learn as children, just as you learn pieces of other languages. Not everyone may become fluent, but almost everyone takes some high school Spanish or some high school French. And I think that it would be great to see ASL be one of those priorities for the education system, primarily because it's easier to learn as a child. But you never know when your child is going to have a deaf student in their class, and to be able to provide that sense of camaraderie with them, if that's all you ever use it for, that's incredible. That's welcome someone into a space where they were excluded before. So I advocate for that. I also like to point out, in terms of Barbie and HBO, the drastic balance between cost and benefit here. I mean, this was a one-time cost for HBO, and you can see already the ripples it's having. How many more views did Barbie get because of this? How many people bought subscriptions because of this? How many people mention it on their podcast, right? So this is a ripple effect that you can't even compare to the cost of one-time services that are now permanently there and can cause so much joy for so many viewers all around the world from one effort. It was a great, important effort. I'm not demeaning it. I'm simply saying that when you're looking at cost benefit, this is a great example.
Well, that's right. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. Right. And I think that is really so much part of our conversation. It's that these two things actually exist at the same time. And if you are really looking to solely be attacking your bottom line, increasing sales and increasing viewership, this is a very direct way to do it. Certainly, I was thinking, well, do I really want to keep Max? Am I going to use that, or am I going to really watch it anymore? If my niece is now kind of going off into their schools, and some of them are going further away. But I was like, I need to know what other things are going to happen. What else is coming? And it absolutely was because of seeing Barbie. And it's such a it changes the way you think about how you're making decisions. For me, it does anyway. But I think it's an incredible start. And so I want to get also back to ICS. We're talking about all of the ways that accessibility is being used, and we can point to it. Talk to us about, even go through a like a new client intake, and how does that work, and what services can they really be looking at for you, short term and long term?
Awesome. So I like to boil down the process in like four prongs. Okay, so the first prong is that consult, and it's vital. That's where you just email staff. We meet with you. We discuss your dream product. We discuss compromises that may need to be made. We discuss budget. We get a full picture of what you actually want in your media. And that looks so different for everyone, which is why we emphasize the importance. We've had people come to us with videos that were in spoken Spanish, and they weren't sure, does that go into Spanish Sign Language? Does that go into ASL? Does that go into just captions? So we always talk through them, and that's the consult phase. The second phase is the material assessment. So my team, after years of trial and error, I mean, this was new for us very recently, so we have learned so much, and we welcome our clients benefit from everything that we've learned. So we do a materials assessment, and this is where we just check for important representation that would be required in the video. And we could talk a little bit more about that a little later, but we check the materials for relevant accessibility topics that we need to address. For example, perhaps the video is a little grainy. We might go to the client and ask for a better quality video or edit that in-house. Perhaps the video really should have Spanish and English captions because both Spanish and English is used in the video. We don't know who will be watching this. So we might go back and say, hey, we propose 2 streams of captions or 2 separate videos. Great. So all of that is the material assessment stage. Then we pull from our professionals, and we have professional captioners, professional sign language interpreters all over the country in various different languages. So we attempt to make the best match possible based on our material assessment and the consult that we did. We do that work either in studio or in home studios that have been pre-approved. It really depends on the situation and the content desire, the quality of content. There are a lot of factors, but somewhere, someone will either interpret or caption the material or provide the AD audio description. After that's been done, we do all of our editing in-house, make it look beautiful. I call my coordinator, Sophia, the queen of post. She loves playing around in post-production. She will do colors. She'll ask if you want a logo. We could do a side-by-side, a picture-in-picture. We have so many options thanks to technology. So she will complete the post-production editing, and then we send off a finished product back to any client. So to tie all that in, that could be you send us a video of a podcast. We meet with you, we discuss the podcast and the goal. We assess the podcast, we find the perfect interpreter. They do an interpretation. We do side-by-side editing with a nice background and a logo, and then send it back for you to publish on YouTube.
Perfect. It's seamless.
It is now. That took some work, not gonna lie. And the reason actually that it takes so much work is both a blessing and I don't want to say a curse, but a challenge. Because what we discovered in media specifically, and with post-production media accessibility, the options are truly endless. We can use anyone from around the world. Within sign language interpreting, especially, specifically that industry, it's really important to try to have a well-matched interpreter. This is because they draw on context of their own lives. They draw on past jobs that they have done, language that they may know, dialects that they may know, also specific jargon. So in an ideal world, there's a perfect interpreter to go to the right job. And that's something that's really hard to achieve in live services. Interpreters could be on vacation. There may be 2 interpreters who are really great in engineering and neither of them are available on a Friday, right? So you have this barrier in live services that doesn't exist here. In this accessible media space, you have a world of options. You get to choose the color of the background, what you think the interpreter should look like to best represent the audience or the speaker. You just have so many options. And so we've learned how to navigate those, but that's why those first 2 steps of the consult and the material assessment is vital.
Oh, absolutely. The endless number of choices can definitely have us going in loops to try and make sure everyone is happy with the end product and also still accessible, of course, because I know sometimes people are like, I want to use this color and I want to look this certain way. And then we're also moving into an inaccessible area. So it is so much about, visual, audio. The levels of accessibility are endless also, right? And I know we're getting to the end of our interview. I feel like we could probably speak on this in particular for hours. But is there anything you want to let our audience know about anything that's coming up, any future developments, upcoming products or projects or events that you want to share with us?
So I didn't come prepared with an event specifically, but I do love to share just before everything wraps up that the best approach, aside from of course finding the agency, talking through your consult, etc. I like to encourage people in their way of thinking about accessibility not being for specific people, but for all of us. And I think that that gets missed sometimes, particularly in this media realm of discussion. People come to me, how do I make this accessible for deaf people? Well, you're not really making it accessible just for deaf people. A lot of people read captions, I myself included. If I'm scrolling and there's no captions, I bypass it. That's it. So you're really bringing everyone to the table because everyone has something to contribute. Everyone has something that could be valuable, whether it be a comment on that YouTube video that you're posting, whether it be someone taking what you're posting and actually using it in their daily life and creating ripples effect from that. Either way you look at it, this isn't something that you can say, oh, that poor community, they don't hear or they, can't see. That's not really why we do this. And I think if we shift our thinking to believe that everyone has something of value worth contributing to any conversation, to any piece of media, and then it's easier to conclude it in that pre-planning stage. Then it makes more sense to you to think, oh, of course, we should also make sure this is accessible. That will create less of an afterthought and more of an internal core reasoning for being inclusive, which is everything.
It is absolutely everything. Thank you so much for that. It's good to really remind our audience who maybe isn't as familiar with this community as we are, that accessibility is for everyone. It truly is, and making that distinction is vital. So thank you so much for that. Shelby, I've had so much fun talking to you today. I cannot wait to talk with you again. And certainly I look forward to all of your upcoming developments and keeping tabs with you.
I can't wait. And thank you so much for prioritizing equal access.
Thank you so much for coming on today. Empire State of Rights has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. The video for this episode is available on our YouTube channel with closed captioning and ASL interpretation. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. For more Empire State of Rights, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.